Hidden in a barn, the millionaire's daughter was found by a street girl, and the reason was St. James awoke as it always did, slowly. With the sun rising behind the hills and the smell of fresh coffee drifting up the cobblestone streets. It was a small town, one of those where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are kept in whispers and truths appear between the lines of Sunday conversations. In the center, the main square still held the same wooden benches from decades ago, and the main church continued to ring its bells at 6 in the morning, precisely as if time there was afraid to move too quickly. But not everything in St. James was as simple as it seemed. There were places where silence weighed more than words, where high walls hid more than they protected, and where old names carried so much weight that merely uttering them made people straighten their posture. One of these places was St. Clair Farm, owned by the Anderson family, built high on a hill a few miles from the center, surrounded by coffee plantations that stretched as far as the eye could see. The main house was imposing, built of stone and hardwood, with high windows that seemed like perpetually closed eyes. Inside, everything breathed order. The furniture was antique but impeccable. The heavy, hand-embroidered curtains filtered the sunlight in a way that left the rooms always in a dim light. Every object had its place. Every step echoed in the wide corridors, and every word was measured before it was spoken. Helen Anderson was the owner of it all. In her early 50s, she maintained an erect posture, her hair always pulled back in a perfect bun, and the sharp gaze of someone who let nothing go unnoticed. Raised in a traditional family, she had learned early on that appearances mattered more than feelings, that reputation was worth more than truth, and that certain subjects simply weren't discussed. She had married Sergio Anderson Young in a union that brought together two fortunes and solidified the family name in the region. They had a daughter, Leah, but few knew about it, and among those who knew, no one dared to ask. Sergio was a man of few words and many absences. A respected businessman, he spent most of his time traveling between New York City, Boston, and other capitals, always with the excuse of urgent business. When he was home, he moved through the rooms like a polite ghost, greeted the servants with a nod, sat silently at the dinner table, and retired to his study shortly after. He was not a cruel man, but neither was he present. He lived in a kind of truce with himself, avoiding looking at what bothered him, pretending that time would resolve what he lacked the courage to face. Leah Anderson was 3 years old when everything began to change. Before that, she was a child like any other, curious, noisy, full of questions. She ran through the house's corridors, played in the garden, asked to be held, laughed loudly. But gradually, something began to bother Helen. The girl had a skin condition, nothing serious but visible, spots that appeared and disappeared, a sensitivity that required constant care, ointments, sun protection, extra attention. For any mother, it would simply be a health issue to be treated with affection. For Helen, it was an unacceptable imperfection. In the beginning, there were small changes. Leah stopped accompanying her mother on social visits. Then she stopped appearing in the dining room when there were guests. Next, she was moved to a room at the back of the house, away from the main circulation. Areas. Helen justified everything with the same phrase, always spoken in a firm tone with no room for questioning. It's for her own good. She needs rest. She can't be exposed. People wouldn't understand. It's better this way. Over time, the isolation deepened. Leah began to live in an increasingly smaller world, limited to 4 walls, a window overlooking the back garden, and quick, controlled visits from Helen, who brought food, clean clothes, and instructions on how to behave. The girl learned not to make noise, not to ask for attention, to exist almost invisibly. There were no family albums, with her photo, no birthday parties, no friends, only silence, the smell of ointment, and the feeling that something was wrong, but without words to name it. Joe Miller had been the farm's caretaker for over 20 years. He knew every corner of those lands, every tree, every stone. He was a simple man of few words, but with an attentive gaze. He noticed things others didn't. He knew when a fence needed repair even before it broke. He knew when the weather would turn just by looking at the sky, and he knew when something wasn't right. Lately he had been noticing strange movements in the old barn, the one at the back of the property, far from the main house. which for years had been used for nothing more than storing rusty tools and forgotten bales of straw. One morning, passing by to check a leak in the roof, Joe Miller heard a noise. It wasn't the wind, nor an animal. It was something different. He pushed the wooden door, which creaked on its old hinges, and entered slowly. Sunlight streamed in thin beams through the cracks, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. In the back, among the bales of straw, he saw a small figure, huddled, motionless. He approached carefully and recognized her. It was Leah. The girl was lying on an improvised bed of old blankets, her eyes open but expressionless. She wasn't crying, wasn't speaking, just breathing slowly, as if she had learned to occupy the smallest possible space. Beside her, there was a pot of ointment, some folded clothes, and a pillow that seemed to have been brought from inside the house. Joe Miller felt his chest tighten. He didn't need explanations. He understood what he was seeing. This wasn't abandonment. It was something worse. It was control disguised as care. He said nothing. He confronted no one. He knew it wouldn't help, but he decided, silently, to do what he could. He began to leave a clean blanket in a corner, a new bar of soap intentionally forgotten, a bottle of fresh water near the entrance. Small gestures that didn't attract attention, but that made a difference. And he continued to observe. On the other side of town, far from the mansions and fenced lands, lived Saul. No one knew her surname, if she even had one. No one knew where she came from or where she was going. At 12 years old, she knew the streets of St. James better than any resident. She knew where to get food without asking. She knew which doorways were safe to sleep under. She knew when it was time to disappear before someone called the police or tried to take her to a shelter. Saul was thin, with sunburnt skin and tangled hair that she cut herself with scissors found in the trash. She wore clothes that were too big, donated or found, and always walked barefoot because shoes were hard to come by, in the right size. But despite everything, there was something about her that caught attention. Her eyes. They were large, dark, and carried a sharp intelligence, an ability to read people and situations with a precision only those who live on the streets develop. She had no family, or at least no memory of one. She vaguely remembered a woman, a smell of soap, a voice singing softly. But they were loose fragments, formless, without context. What she had was the present, the now, the need to survive another day. And she did it well. She didn't steal, didn't beg, persistently didn't get into trouble. She just existed on the fringes, invisible to most but always alert. One night of heavy rain, Saul sought shelter. The downtown awnings were occupied and the familiar alleys were flooded. She walked to the outskirts of town, where houses were more spaced out and streets turned into dirt roads. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of a large property, surrounded by low walls and dense vegetation. There seemed to be no movement. She climbed the fence with ease, crossed an open field and spotted the barn. The door was ajar. She entered. The smell was of wet straw and old wood. She searched for a dry corner away from the leaks and settled among the bales. It was then that she heard it. A breath, faint but present. She turned slowly and saw a child, small, with fair skin, with wide eyes that watched her without fear but also without hope. Saul remained motionless. She didn't know what to do. She thought of leaving, of pretending she hadn't seen anything, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the way the girl looked at her. Perhaps it was the recognition of a loneliness similar to her own. She stayed there in silence until the rain passed. When day broke, she left without a sound. But she returned the next night, and the next, and the next, always bringing something. A piece of bread that was left over, a fruit found at the market, a clean cloth that had dried in the sun. The girl, who Saul later discovered was named Leah, began to react. At first, she only accepted what was offered. Then, she began to smile. Faint, shy, but genuine. Saul didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew it wasn't normal. A child didn't stay alone in a barn by chance. She began to observe more. She noticed that Leah was clean, that her clothes were of good quality, that basic care was being taken. But she also noticed the absence. No one came to play with her, no one talked, No one touched her with affection. It was as if the girl were a stored object, kept in good condition but lifeless. Over time, Sewell's visits became routine. She spent part of the night in the barn, sometimes just sitting beside Leah, sometimes telling invented stories, sometimes humming songs she didn't even know where she had learned. Leah began to respond. She babbled loose words, pointed at things, asked with gestures. And Sewell, who had never cared for anyone but herself, discovered that she liked it. She liked being needed. She liked seeing the girl smile. She liked feeling that for the first time in her life she mattered to someone. Joe Miller continued to observe. He noticed Saul's presence even before he saw her. He noticed the signs, the bread that appeared, the new cloth, the change in Leah's behavior. He staked out one night and saw when the street girl entered the barn. His first impulse was to expel her, to warn his employer, to fulfill his role. But when he saw the scene, when he saw the care with which Sewell adjusted the blanket over Leah, when he saw the child's smile, he changed his mind. He decided not to interfere. More than that, he decided to help. He started leaving more things: a bar of soap, a towel, a pot of food. He never spoke to Sewell directly, but he knew she understood. Meanwhile, in the main house, Helen began to feel that something was different. Small things disappeared. A cloth from the laundry room, a juice pitcher from the kitchen. The back door creaked when it shouldn't. These were minimal details, but for someone who lived by absolute control, they sounded like alarms. More than that, Leah seemed different. When Helen visited her in the barn, the girl was no longer apathetic. There was a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't existed before. A restlessness, a will. Helen didn't like it. She increased her vigilance. She started going to the barn at different times without warning. She questioned Joe Miller, who responded with monosyllables and a neutral gaze. She searched the place, looking for signs of invasion, but found nothing concrete, only the uncomfortable feeling that she was losing control. And for Helen, losing control was unacceptable. On a hot afternoon in January, while Helen was reviewing the farm's accounts in the study, she heard a noise coming from the back. She stood up, walked down the corridor, and exited through the kitchen door. She walked to the barn with firm steps. She pushed the door open and entered. Leah was there as always, but something was different. Beside her, a drawing made with charcoal. On the dirt floor, simple, childish but intentional shapes. A house, two figures, a sun. Helen felt her blood run cold. Leah didn't know how to draw. She had never had pencils, paper, nothing. Someone was teaching her. Someone was interfering. She looked at her daughter with a mixture of anger and fear. Who was here? Leah didn't answer. She only lowered her eyes. Helen repeated the question, louder, firmer. Nothing. The girl remained silent as she always did when she sensed danger. Helen left the barn furious. She called Joe Miller and demanded explanations. The caretaker remained calm, said he hadn't seen anything, that maybe it was some animal, some wind, something unimportant. Helen didn't believe him, but she also had no proof. She ordered him to reinforce vigilance, to lock the barn at night, not to let anyone approach. Joe Miller nodded, but inwardly he knew he wouldn't do any of that. That same night, Sewell returned. She found the barn door locked. She tried to force it open, but couldn't. She went around, looked for another entrance, and found a small side window, but sufficient. She entered with difficulty, scratching her arms on the splintered wood. Leah was awake, waiting. When she saw Sewell, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of relief. Sewell approached, wiped the girl's face with her shirt sleeve, and whispered, "I won't leave you." Leah didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the promise. And for the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, in the main house, Helen couldn't sleep. Lying beside Sergio, who snored lightly, she stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of something she couldn't name. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't regret, it was fear. Fear that everything she had built, the entire image of a perfect family, all the carefully maintained reputation, would crumble because of a child she couldn't accept. She got up, went to the window, and looked out. The night was dark, moonless, and the silence was absolute. But far away in the barn, a faint light flickered. A candle, or perhaps just her imagination. Helen forcefully closed the curtain and returned to bed, but the discomfort remained. The next day, during a deeper cleaning of the barn, Sewell found something that changed everything. Among old boxes and forgotten clothes, there was a photo. Old, faded, with edges yellowed by time. In it, 2 women. One was Helen, younger, with the same hard gaze. The other was unknown, but there was something familiar. Sewell turned the photo over. On the back, a date and a name, Clarice Meadows, and below a handwritten note, "My sister." Sewell felt her heart race. Clarice Meadows. That name echoed somewhere distant in her memory. She was sure she had heard it before. But where? When? She put the photo in her pocket and decided to investigate. She knew there was more to this story than met the eye. And if there was one thing Sewell had learned on the streets, it was to follow the signs. In the following days, Sewell began to ask discreet questions around town. She asked the bakery owner, the man who sold fruit at the market, the woman who washed clothes by the river. No one knew much, but little by little, fragments of information began to come together. Clarice Meadows had been Helen's sister, younger, freer, more rebellious. She had gotten pregnant young, unmarried, and this had caused a scandal in the family. After that, she disappeared. Some said she had gone to New York City, others that she had died. No one was sure. Sewell felt a shiver. What if Clarice was her mother? What if that photo was the only proof of a connection she never knew existed? The pieces began to fit together in a way that was both frightening and fascinating. If this were true, then Leah was not just a child she was helping. She was her cousin, her family. While Sewell processed this discovery, at the farm, things began to heat up. Rumors began to circulate in St. James. Someone had seen a strange girl lurking around the Anderson property. Someone had heard noises in the barn. Someone had commented that the family was hiding something. The gossip, which in a small town spreads faster than news, reached Helen's ears, and she knew she needed to act. She called Sergio for a serious conversation, something that rarely happened. She said they needed to make a decision about Leah, that they couldn't maintain the situation as it was, that people were starting to ask questions. Sergio, as always, tried to avoid confrontation. He said that perhaps it was time to seek real medical help, to stop hiding, to face reality. Helen reacted with fury. It wasn't a matter of medicine, it was a matter of image, of reputation, of control. The discussion stretched into the night, with voices growing louder, accusations growing harsher. Sergio, for the first time in years, confronted his wife. He said she was sick, that she was destroying their own daughter, that she needed to stop. Helen replied that he had no right to speak, that he spent his life running away, that he had never been a real father. The words cut like blades, opening old wounds that had never healed. In the barn, Leah heard the distant echoes of the argument. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood that something was changing. Sewell, who was beside her, held her small hand and squeezed it tightly. "I won't let anything bad happen to you." Leah looked at her, and for the first time spoke. "Thank you." The word came out softly, almost inaudible, but clear. Sewell felt her eyes sting. She didn't know if it was emotion, exhaustion, or fear of what was to come, but she knew she had made the right choice. No matter what happened, she would not abandon that child, because now more than ever she was sure they were connected, not just by chance, but by blood, by history, by destiny. And as the night advanced over St. James, with its silent streets and buried secrets, 2 girls remained together in the dark of a forgotten barn, united by an invisible thread that neither time nor fear nor shame could break. The morning arrived with a heavy silence over St. Clair Farm. The sun slowly rose, painting the sky orange and pink, but inside the main house the atmosphere was icy. Helen hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night sitting in the armchair in her room, staring out the window, her mind spinning in circles. The argument with Sergio had left its marks. Not on the walls, not on the furniture, but in that invisible space that exists between two people who have shared a lifetime without ever truly knowing each other. Sergio, for his part, had left the house before dawn. He said he had an urgent meeting in Boston, but both knew it was a lie. It was an escape. It was what he always did when things got too difficult to face. Helen didn't even try to stop him. She just watched from the window as the car drove down the dirt road, raising dust, disappearing around the bend. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, a loneliness she couldn't disguise. In the barn, Sewell woke to the sound of birds. She had slept little, but she was used to it. She looked at Leah, who was still sleeping curled up among the blankets, and felt a wave of protection so strong it almost hurt. She slowly got up, stretched her aching body, and went to fetch water. Joe Miller was already nearby, mending a fence. When he saw Sewell, he nodded. She returned the gesture. They exchanged no words, but there was an understanding there, a silent complicity. Joe Miller approached, and without looking directly at her, left a package on the ground. "There's bread and cheese in there, and some milk." Sewell picked up the package, murmured an almost inaudible thank you, and returned to the barn. She knew this couldn't last forever. She knew that at some point someone would find out, would intervene, would separate them. But as long as she could, she would stay there, because for the first time in her life she felt she had a purpose. Inside the barn, Leah was already awake. Sitting on the straw, she looked at her hands, moving her fingers slowly, as if discovering they existed. Sewell approached, opened the package, and offered the bread. Leah took it carefully, bit slowly, and chewed in silence. Then she looked at Sewell and said, in a thin, hesitant voice, "Are you leaving?" Sewell felt her chest tighten. She shook her head. "No, I'm not." Leah seemed to relax. She continued eating, but now with less tension in her shoulders. Sewell sat beside her and watched. The girl did have marks on her skin, yes, but they weren't monstrous, as Helen seemed to believe. They were just spots, lighter, more sensitive areas. Nothing that justified that isolation. Nothing that justified that prison disguised as care. Meanwhile, in town, the rumors continued to grow. At the bakery, at the market, in the square, people talked. They said the Anderson family was hiding a sick child. They said the girl had a serious, contagious, dangerous condition. They said Helen was ashamed, that Sergio pretended nothing was happening, that the farm held secrets beyond anyone's imagination. Each version of the story was more exaggerated than the last, and the truth, as always happens in small towns, was buried under layers of speculation. It was in this climate that, on a Tuesday afternoon, a man no one knew appeared. Tall, wearing glasses, with a leather briefcase under his arm, he entered the town hall and asked for information about the Anderson family. The clerk, curious, asked why. He said he was a doctor, that he had been contacted years ago to evaluate a child with a rare dermatological condition, but had never received a follow-up. He said he had seen a vague news item about the family and decided to come in person. The news spread in minutes. An outside doctor, looking for the Andersons, talking about a sick child. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in people's minds, and the pressure on the family increased. Helen was informed by an acquaintance who called, feigning concern, but actually just wanting to confirm the rumors. When she hung up the phone, Helen felt the ground tremble. Everything she had tried to hide, everything she had controlled so carefully, was about to come to light. She called Joe Miller and ordered him to take Leah into the house, to put her in the back room, to lock the door, not to let anyone approach. Joe Miller hesitated. For the first time in 20 years of service, he thought of disobeying, but he knew he had no power to do so. He nodded and went to the barn. When he got there, he found Sewell and Leah together, playing with colorful pebbles Sewell had found by the river. Joe Miller stopped at the entrance, looked at the two and felt his heart heavy. "Girl," he said, looking at Sewell, "you need to leave, now." Sewell stood up, placing herself in front of Leah. "Why?" Joe Miller sighed. "Because the mistress ordered it, and if you don't leave, it will be worse for everyone." Sewell clenched her fists. "I won't leave her alone." Joe Miller took a step forward. It's not about what you want. It's about what's possible. There was a tense silence. Leah, sensing danger, began to cry softly. Saul looked at her, then at Joe Miller, and made a decision. Okay, I'll leave, but I'll come back. Joe Miller didn't answer. He just watched as Saul knelt, hugged Leah, and whispered something in the girl's ear. Then she stood up and left the barn, without looking back. Joe Miller picked Leah up. The girl didn't resist, but she also didn't stop crying. He carried her to the main house, went up the back stairs, and placed her in the room Helen had prepared. A small room with a bed, a chair, and a window with bars. Helen was waiting at the door. She locked it as soon as Joe Miller left and stood there looking at her daughter as if looking at a problem she didn't know how to solve. Leah curled up on the bed, hugging her knees, and continued crying. Helen approached, tried to touch the girl's shoulder, but Leah pulled away. For the first time, the child reacted, not with words but with her body, with refusal. Helen felt something strange. It wasn't anger, it was almost like hurt, as if her daughter had betrayed an unspoken rule. She left the room and locked the door, leaving Leah alone. Meanwhile, Saul wandered the streets of St. James aimlessly without destination. She was furious with Joe Miller, with Helen, with the whole world. But more than that, she was determined. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't leave Leah in that prison. She needed help. She needed someone with power, influence, courage. And it was then that she remembered the doctor, the man who had appeared in town asking about the Andersons. Saul ran to the town hall. She arrived sweaty, her heart pounding, and asked for the clerk. "Where is the doctor who came asking about the Andersons?" The clerk, suspicious, asked why. Saul improvised. "I know where the girl is." The clerk's eyes widened. She took a piece of paper, wrote down the address of a guest house downtown, and handed it over. "He's staying here." Saul ran out. She crossed the square, passed the church, and reached the guest house. She climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time and knocked on the door of the indicated room. A man opened it. It was him. Tall, wearing glasses, with a serious but gentle expression. He looked at Saul, surprised. "Yes?" Saul took a deep breath. "I know where the girl you're looking for is, and she needs help." The doctor, who introduced himself as Dr. Alistair Nolan, invited Saul in. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened as she told him everything. About Leah, about the barn, about Helen, about the isolation. She spoke quickly, without pauses, afraid that if she stopped, she would lose her courage. Dr. Nolan listened in silence, making mental notes, and when Saul finished, he asked, "Are you sure about all this?" Saul looked him in the eyes. "Yes, I saw her. I took care of her." Dr. Nolan stood up, picked up his briefcase, and said, "I'm going to the farm now." Saul felt a mix of relief and fear. What if Helen wouldn't let him in? What if she denied everything? What if she sent Leah away? Dr. Nolan seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry, I have legal authorization to investigate cases of child neglect. If what you said is true, this child will receive the care she deserves." While Dr. Nolan prepared to go to the farm, Saul returned to the streets. She couldn't go with him. She knew her presence would only complicate things. But she couldn't stay still. She walked to the edge of town, climbed a hill from where she could see St. Clair Farm in the distance, and stayed there waiting, praying that everything would work out. At the farm, Helen was in her study when she heard the sound of a car coming up the road. She looked out the window and saw an unknown vehicle parking in front of the house. A man got out with a briefcase under his arm and walked to the main door. He rang the doorbell. Helen slowly descended the stairs, adjusted her hair, and opened the door with the most neutral expression she could muster. Dr. Nolan introduced himself. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson. My name is Alistair Nolan. I am a medical specialist in pediatric dermatology. Your family contacted me some years ago to evaluate a child with a skin condition. I have come to check on the situation." Helen felt her blood run cold, but maintained her composure. "I think there's been a mistake, Doctor. We don't have any child with health problems here." Dr. Nolan was unfazed. "I understand, but I have received information that there is a girl named Leah living on this property, and that she may be in an inadequate situation of isolation. As a doctor and a citizen, I have a duty to verify. Helen felt anger rise, but she knew she couldn't lose control. With all the politeness she could gather, she said, "Doctor, my daughter is fine. She just has a condition that requires special care. There is nothing wrong happening here." Dr. Nolan took a step forward. "Then there would be no problem for me to see her, correct? Just to confirm she is receiving adequate treatment." Helen hesitated. She knew that if she refused, she would look guilty, but if she allowed it, she would lose control. She tried to buy time. "She's resting now. It's not a good time." Dr. Nolan kept his tone firm. "Mrs. Anderson, I can return with a court order if necessary, or we can resolve this now, civilly." Helen realized she had no way out. She nodded, went upstairs, and opened the door to the room where Leah was. The girl was lying on the bed on her back, motionless. Dr. Nolan entered slowly, approached, and knelt beside the bed. Leah turned her face and looked at him with eyes red from crying. Dr. Nolan smiled gently. "Hi, Leah. My name is Alistair. I'm a doctor. I came to see how you are." Leah didn't answer, but she also didn't pull away. Dr. Nolan carefully examined her skin, asked gentle questions, observed the environment. Then he stood up and left the room. Helen was waiting in the corridor, arms crossed. Dr. Nolan faced her. "This child has no condition that justifies isolation. What she has is moderate atopic dermatitis, completely treatable with basic care. Keeping her locked up is neglect, Mrs. Anderson." Helen tried to defend herself. "I do what's best for her. I protect her from stares, from judgments, from—" Dr. Nolan interrupted. "You are protecting yourself, not her, and that needs to change. I will write a report and forward it to the competent authorities. If there are no immediate changes, legal measures will be taken." Helen felt her world collapse. Everything she had built, her entire image, her entire reputation, was crumbling. She tried to argue, but Dr. Nolan was already descending the stairs. He stopped at the door, turned and said, "This girl deserves to live. Truly live. Not hidden as if she were a mistake." And he left. Helen stood still in the corridor, trembling, not from cold, but from anger, fear, and something that dangerously resembled shame. She entered Leah's room, looked at her daughter, and for the first time, truly saw her. Not as a problem, not as an imperfection, but as a child, small, frightened, alone. And she felt something break inside her. Meanwhile, Sewell remained on the hill, observing. She saw the doctor's car leave the farm and drive down the road. She ran to the guest house and waited for him to arrive. When Dr. Nolan got out of the car, she approached him. "So?" he sighed. "The girl is there, and she is in an inadequate situation. I will take legal action, but it will take time." Sewell felt frustration tighten her chest. Time was what Leah didn't have. Every day in that place was a day stolen from her childhood. But she knew she couldn't do anything more alone. She thanked the doctor and walked away aimlessly, just trying to process everything. That night, Sewell didn't return to the barn. She stayed in the square, sitting on a bench, looking at the stars. She thought of Leah. She thought of the photo she had found. She thought of Clarice Meadows. She thought of everything she had discovered and everything she still didn't know. And she made a decision. She was going to find out the truth, all of it. Because if she really was part of that family, if she really had Anderson blood in her veins, then she had a right to know, and she had a right to fight. At St. Clair Farm, Helen couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in years, she cried. She didn't cry for her daughter. She cried for herself, for the prison she had built with her own hands, for the life she had wasted trying to maintain appearances, for the emptiness she felt and that no expensive furniture, no reputation, no surname could fill. And in the back room, Leah also couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, hugging her pillow, she thought of Sewell, of the street girl who had appeared out of nowhere and changed everything, who had brought food, affection, attention, who had made her feel seen. And for the first time, Leah understood that she no longer wanted to live hidden. She wanted to go out. She wanted to see the world. She wanted to be free. Dawn arrived slowly, bringing with it the promise of changes. Changes that no one yet knew exactly how they would come, but that everyone felt in the air. Because in St. James, among the silent hills and buried secrets, something was about to explode. And when it exploded, nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed Dr. Nolan's visit were marked by a tension that seemed to thicken the air at St. Clair Farm. Helen moved through the house like a ghost, pale with deep dark circles under her eyes, avoiding the gaze of the servants. Joe Miller maintained his routine but noticed every detail. His employer was different. She was no longer that woman of rigid posture and firm commands. Something was broken in her, something she herself didn't know how to fix. Leah remained in the back room, but now the door was no longer locked. Helen had removed the key after spending an entire night looking at it, feeling the weight of the metal as if it were an accusation. The girl rarely went out, only to go to the bathroom or eat something in the kitchen, always accompanied, always in silence. But there was a subtle change in her eyes. It was no longer the apathy from before. It was anticipation, as if she was waiting for something, or someone. Sewell, for her part, had not stopped. In recent days, she had travelled St. James from end to end, asking questions, piecing together a story that no one wanted to tell completely. She spoke with the owner of the oldest guest house in town, with the priest of the main church, with the midwife who had served the region for decades. Each conversation brought a fragment. Each fragment formed an image. It was the midwife, Mrs. Irene, who finally confirmed what Sewell already suspected. Sitting on the porch of her simple house, with a glass of lemonade in hand, the woman looked at Sewell with a mixture of pity and respect. "You're Clarice's daughter, aren't you?" Sewell felt her heart race. "I am?" Mrs. Irene nodded slowly. "You have her eyes, the same stubbornness in your chin. I delivered you. It was right here, in this house, 12 years ago." Sewell could barely breathe. "And my mother, where is she?" Mrs. Irene sighed deeply. "Clarice didn't make it, my child. She had complications shortly after you were born. We tried everything, but it didn't work. She asked me one thing before she passed. She asked me to take care of you, not to let you go to her family. She said they would never accept you, that it was better for you to grow up away from that name." Tears streamed down Sewell's face without her realizing it. Mrs. Irene continued, "I tried, child. I swear I tried. But I was old, poor, without means. You stayed with me for a few months. But then, child, Protective Services wanted to take you. I couldn't register you. I had no documents. You disappeared into the system. And I never heard from you again. Until now." Sewell wiped her face with the back of her hand. "So Helen is my aunt, and Leah is my cousin," Mrs. Irene confirmed. "Yes, and if you're here, it's because fate wanted you to meet." Sewell stood up, thanked her, and left with her head spinning. Everything made sense now, the photo, the connection, the feeling of belonging she had felt while caring for Leah. It wasn't just empathy, it was blood. Meanwhile, at the farm, an official letter arrived. Helen opened it with trembling hands. It was from Child Protective Services, informing her that an investigation had been opened into Leah Anderson's living conditions. They requested a scheduled home visit for the following week and recommended that the child be enrolled in school and have access to age-appropriate social activities. The letter ended with a warning. Failure to comply with the recommendations could result in more severe legal measures. Helen sat in the armchair in her study and stared at the paper. She read it over and over, as if expecting the words to change. But they didn't. The reality was there, printed, undeniable. There was no longer any way to hide, no longer any way to control. Everything she had done, all the justifications she had created, crumbled before a sheet of letterhead paper. Sergio returned that afternoon. He entered the house without warning, found Helen in the study, and saw the letter on the table. He read it in silence. Then he looked at his wife and said in a tired voice, "It's time, Helen. We can't run anymore." She didn't answer. She just kept staring into space. Sergio pulled up a chair and sat in front of her. "We need to talk, truly, without lies. without excuses. Helen looked up. There was something different in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. "You don't understand, Sergio. You never understood." Sergio shook his head. "I understand more than you imagine. I understand that you were afraid. I understand that you were raised to value appearances above all else. But that doesn't justify what we did to our daughter." "What you did?" Helen felt the accusation like a slap. "I did? And you? Where were you when I needed support? When I didn't know what to do? You ran, Sergio. You always ran." Sergio lowered his head. "It's true. I ran. And I regret it every day. But now I'm here, and I will do what I should have done a long time ago. I will take care of my daughter." There was a long silence. Helen felt something stir within her. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't relief. It was just the recognition that she was tired of fighting alone against something she herself had created. She stood up, walked to the window, and said, almost in a whisper, "I don't know how to fix this." Sergio approached. "No one knows, but we try, together." That night, for the first time in years, Sergio and Helen had dinner with Leah. They set the table in the kitchen, not in the formal dining room, and called the girl. Leah slowly descended the stairs, suspicious, and sat on the edge of the chair as if ready to run at any moment. Sergio served her plate. Helen poured juice into her glass, and the three ate in silence. It wasn't a magical moment. There were no hugs, declarations of love, or dramatic apologies. It was just dinner. But for Leah, who had spent years eating alone, hidden, that was revolutionary. She looked at her parents, still not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling that something had changed. Meanwhile, Sul was in the square, sitting on the same bench as always, looking at the city lights. She thought about everything she had discovered, about everything she still needed to do. She knew she couldn't simply appear at the farm and announce that she was Helen's niece. She knew she needed a plan, but before anything else she needed to see Leah. She needed to know if she was okay. The next day, Sul woke with a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She bathed in the river, put on the cleanest clothes she had, and walked to the farm. She didn't enter through the fence as before. This time she went to the main gate and rang the doorbell. Joe Miller answered, surprised. "Girl, what are you doing here?" Sul took a deep breath. "I need to speak with Mrs. Helen." Joe Miller hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Sul insisted. "Please, it's important." Joe Miller looked at her, saw the seriousness in her eyes, and agreed. "Wait here." He went up to the house, found Helen in the living room, and said, "There's a girl at the gate. Says she needs to speak with you." Helen frowned. "What girl?" Joe Miller described her. Helen felt a shiver. She knew who it was, the street girl, the one who had cared for Leah. Helen went down to the gate. Sul was on the other side, arms crossed, trying to look more confident than she really felt. The two stared at each other. Helen spoke first. "What do you want?" Sul didn't avert her gaze. "I want to see Leah." Helen took a step back. "That's none of your business." Sul took a step forward. "Yes, it is. Because I'm her family." Helen stopped. "What?" Sul took the photo from her pocket, the one she had found in the barn, and showed it. "Clarice Meadows was my mother, and she was your sister. That makes me your niece, and Leah's cousin." Helen took the photo with trembling hands. She looked at the image, at Clarice's face, and felt her legs weaken. "No, it can't be," Sul continued. "Yes, it can. I was born here in St. James. My mother didn't survive childbirth. Mrs. Irene told me everything. Did you know she was pregnant?" Helen couldn't speak. She just shook her head. Sul felt anger rise. "So you abandoned your own sister, and now you're doing the same thing to your own daughter." Helen felt tears stream down her face. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know. Clarice disappeared. She never contacted us again. I thought that—" Sul interrupted. "Thought what? That she disappeared because she wanted to? She was alone, pregnant, scared. And you didn't go after. Her. Helen covered her face with her hands. You don't understand. My father, my family, they wouldn't accept it. I couldn't. Sewell took a step back, disgusted. You always had a choice. You just chose wrong. Helen looked at the niece she never knew she had, and felt the weight of all the decisions she had made. She felt the weight of an entire life built on fear and appearances, and for the first time, she didn't try to justify herself. She just said, in a broken voice, I'm sorry. Sewell didn't expect that. She stood in silence, processing. Helen wiped her face, opened the gate and said, Come in, come see Leah. Sewell hesitated but entered. She walked beside Helen to the house, went up the stairs, and stopped at Leah's bedroom door. Helen opened the door. Leah was sitting on the bed, drawing with colored pencils that Sergio had bought the day before. When she saw Sewell, Leah's eyes lit up. She dropped the pencils, stood up, and ran. Sewell knelt down and opened her arms. Leah threw herself into them, hugging tightly, as if afraid it was a dream. Sewell felt her eyes sting, but she didn't cry. She just held the girl, stroked her hair and whispered, I'm back. I promised I'd come back. Helen watched from the doorway, and for the first time she saw what she had denied for so long. She saw her daughter smiling. She saw her daughter being a child. She saw her daughter loved. And she understood that she had never given that to her, that she had spent years worrying about what others would think, and had never worried about what her own daughter felt. In the following days, things truly began to change. Leah was enrolled in the town school. On the first day, Helen accompanied her, holding her daughter's hand tightly, facing the curious glances, the whispers, the judgments. It was difficult, but it was necessary. Leah entered the classroom, sat at a desk near the window, and for the first time she had classmates. She had a teacher. She had a routine. Sewell, for her part, was taken in by Mrs. Irene, who insisted that the girl live with her. It wasn't luxury, but it was a roof, a bed, warm food. And for the first time, Sewell had an address. She had a place to return to. She continued visiting Leah, now officially, accepted by the family. The two cousins spent afternoons together, playing in the farm's garden, talking, laughing. Sergio began to spend more time at home. It wasn't perfect. He still struggled to express feelings, but he was present. He took Leah for walks in town, bought ice cream, taught her to ride a bicycle. Small gestures that, added together, made a difference. Helen, for her part, began a painful process of self-recognition. She sought psychological help, something she had never considered before. In the sessions, she spoke about her rigid childhood, about the pressures, about the fear of not being perfect. She spoke about Clarice, about the guilt she carried for not having gone after her sister. She spoke about Leah, about the stolen years, about the regret that hurt more than any external judgment. The town, of course, didn't stop talking, but now the rumors were different. They spoke about the Anderson girl who had appeared in school, about Helen's niece who had been found, about the family that was trying to rebuild itself. Some judged, others rooted for them, but everyone observed. On a Saturday afternoon, Leah asked to go to the square. Helen agreed, and the three went together, Helen, Leah, and Sewell. They walked through the streets of St. James, past the church, the bakery, the market. People stared, but Helen didn't avert her gaze. She held her daughter's hand firmly and kept walking. In the square, Leah ran to the swing. Sewell pushed her, and the girl laughed loudly, with a joy that echoed throughout the space. Helen sat on a bench, watching, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't complete happiness, it wasn't full redemption, but it was peace, a small, fragile, but real peace. Dr. Nolan returned to town a few weeks later for a follow-up. He visited the farm, examined Leah, talked with Helen and Sergio. In the end, he gave a positive report. The child was well cared for, socialized, happy. He recommended the continuation of dermatological treatment, but stated that there was no longer any reason for legal concern. Before leaving, Dr. Nolan spoke with Sewell. You made a difference, you know. If it weren't for you, this girl would still be hidden. Sewell shrugged. I just did what was right. Dr. Nolan smiled. Many people don't even do that. You have courage and heart. Don't lose that. That night, Saul returned to Mrs. Irene's house, lay down on the bed that was now hers, and looked at the ceiling. She thought about everything that had happened. She thought about the mother she never knew, the family she had discovered, the cousin she had saved, and for the first time in her life she felt that she belonged somewhere. At St. Clair Farm, Leah slept peacefully, with the window open, letting the night breeze in. She was no longer afraid of the dark. She was no longer afraid of being seen, because now finally she was free. And Helen, lying beside Sergio, looked at the ceiling and thought. She thought about everything she had lost due to fear. She thought about everything she could still recover. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But for the first time she was willing to try, because she had understood finally that appearances didn't matter, that reputation didn't warm, that the only legacy worth leaving was love, and that she still had time to build. Dawn arrived gently over St. James, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. And among the silent hills, the buried secrets began to lose their power, because the truth, however painful it might be, always set free, and freedom, however frightening it might seem, was always worth it. The following months brought changes that no one in St. James imagined possible. St. Clair Farm, which for so long had been a symbol of secrets and silences, began to breathe differently. The windows were open more often, letting the sunlight in and illuminating the corners that had previously lived in shadow. The garden, once impeccable but empty, now had toys scattered, a bicycle leaning against the porch, and laughter echoing among the trees. Leah had adapted to school better than anyone expected. At first it was difficult. The other children looked at her with curiosity, asked questions she didn't know how to answer, and there were times when she closed herself off, returning to that silence that had been her protection for so long. But gradually, with the help of a patient teacher and some kind classmates, Leah began to open up. She befriended a girl named Julia, who lived near the square and had a sweet way of including everyone in games. Julia didn't care about Leah's skin spots, didn't ask intrusive questions, just treated her like any other child. And that, for Leah, was everything. For the first time she had a friend, someone who waited for her at the school gate, who shared lunch, who invited her to play during recess. Saul, for her part, had also started studying. Mrs. Irene had managed to enroll her in a public school, and although Saul had a lot of catching up to do, she was intelligent and determined. She spent her nights studying by lamplight, with Mrs. Irene by her side helping where she could. It was difficult, but Saul didn't give up, because for the first time she saw a future. She saw possibilities. On weekends, Saul went to the farm. Helen had formalized the situation, recognizing Saul as her niece, and although the relationship between the two was still delicate, there was respect. Helen would never be an affectionate aunt, but she was trying. She asked how Saul was doing in school, if she needed anything, if Mrs. Irene was well. Small gestures that, coming from someone like Helen, meant a lot. Sergio, on the other hand, had been surprised to discover he had a niece. At first he didn't know how to react, but he soon realized that Saul was an important part of Leah's recovery. He saw how his daughter lit up when her cousin arrived, how the two talked, played, and understood each other without needing many words. And that touched him. He began to include Saul in outings, ice cream trips, and bike rides. And Saul, who had never had a father figure, was beginning to understand what it was like to have someone who cared. But not everything was easy. Helen still struggled with her own demons. There were days when she looked at Leah and felt such immense guilt that she could barely breathe. There were nights when she woke up sweating, dreaming of the barn, of the stolen years, of her daughter crying alone. Therapy helped, but it was a slow, painful process, full of relapses. In one of those sessions, the psychologist asked, "Helen, have you ever thought about apologizing to Leah? Truly?" Helen remained silent. Then she said, "She's too young. She won't understand." The psychologist shook her head. "Children understand more than we imagine, and even if she doesn't understand everything now, she will. Remember, she will know that you tried." That night, Helen entered Leah's room. The girl was lying down, flipping through a storybook that Sergio had bought. Helen sat on the edge of the bed, and Leah looked at her, surprised. Her mother rarely came in there without a reason. Helen took a deep breath and said, "Leah, I need to tell you something." Leah closed the book and waited. Helen continued, her voice trembling. "I did wrong things to you, things that hurt you. I hid you because I was afraid of what people would think, what they would say. And that was selfish, it was cowardly. You didn't deserve that, you deserved to be loved, cared for, free, and I didn't give that to you, I'm sorry." Leah looked at her mother, processing the words. Then, in a thin voice, she asked, "You don't like me?" Helen felt her heart break. "No, my child, I like you, I love you. I just didn't know how to show it. But I will learn. I promise I will learn." Leah thought for a moment, then extended her small hand and touched Helen's face. "Okay." Helen held her daughter's hand and cried. It wasn't a dramatic cry, but a silent, deep one. Leah didn't fully understand, but she felt that something important had happened. She lay down again, and Helen stayed there, holding her hand until she fell asleep. When she left the room, Sergio was in the corridor waiting. He saw his wife's face and understood. He hugged her, and the two stood there in silence, sharing a burden that was finally beginning to lighten. Meanwhile, in town, the rumors had given way to gradual acceptance. People still talked, of course, but now with less venom. They saw Leah, in school, playing, laughing, and realized there was nothing wrong with her. They saw Sule always beside her cousin and commented on how beautiful it was to see the two together. They saw Helen, facing the stairs, and some, the older ones, began to respect the courage that required. But not everyone was willing to let the past lie quiet. A journalist from Boston, who had heard about the story, appeared in St. James wanting to write an article. He sought people to interview, tried to speak with Helen, with Sergio, even with Mrs. Irene. Everyone refused. But he didn't give up. He published an article anyway, based on rumors and half-truths, with a sensationalist title, "Traditional New England Family Hid Daughter Out of Shame." The article caused a small stir. Some outsiders began commenting on social media, judging, and giving opinions without knowing the full story. Helen was devastated. She felt that all the effort, all the change, had been in vain, that she would always be seen as the woman who hid her own daughter. Sergio tried to calm her, but she was inconsolable. It was Sule who had the idea. She approached Helen and said, "You need to tell the story, the right way. Not to justify yourself, but to show that you've changed, that you're trying." Helen hesitated. "I don't know if I can," Sule insisted. "Yes, you can, and I'll be by your side." Helen thought for days. She talked with the psychologist, with Sergio, with herself. And finally she decided. She gave an interview to the St. James local newspaper, a small but respected publication. She told everything, about the fear, about the family pressure, about the mistakes she had made. She didn't try to justify herself, didn't blame anyone. She just took responsibility and spoke about the change. The interview was published in a Sunday edition. People read it, commented, debated. Some continued to judge, others were moved. But the most important thing was that Helen had spoken. She had put the truth out there, and that, in some way, liberated her. Leah, who couldn't yet read completely, asked Sule to tell her what was written. Sule read aloud, adapting some parts so her cousin would understand. When she finished, Leah was silent. Then she asked, "Is my mum sad?" Sule replied, "She is, but she's trying to get better." Leah thought, "Then I'll help her." And she helped, in the way a 7-year-old child can help, with colourful drawings she left on the breakfast table, with unexpected hugs, with smiles, with forgiveness, because children have an incredible capacity to forgive, to move on, to not hold grudges. And Leah, despite everything, still had that. The months continued to pass. Winter arrived, bringing cold and fog to St. James. Mornings were chilly, and people walked the streets wrapped in coats and scarves. On the farm, Sergio had a fireplace installed in the living room, and evenings became marked by gatherings around the fire. Leah, Sule, Helen, Sergio, and sometimes Mrs. Irene, who was invited for dinner. These were simple but significant moments. They talked about the day, about school, about plans for the future. Leah talked about her classes, about her teacher, about Julia. Sewell talked about the books she was reading, about the subjects she liked most. Sergio commented on work, but now with less urgency, less escape. And Helen, little by little, learned to participate, to listen, to be present. One of those nights, Leah asked, "Mom, can I have a birthday party?" Helen paused, surprised. She had never thrown a party for her daughter. She had never celebrated. She felt guilt tighten but swallowed it and replied, "Of course, my child, you can." Leah smiled, excited. "Can I invite Julia? And Sewell? And Joe Miller?" Helen smiled back. "You can invite whoever you want." Preparation for the party took weeks. Leah was excited, making guest lists, choosing the cake, deciding on games. Helen got completely involved, wanting everything to be perfect. Not for appearances, but because she wanted to see her daughter happy. Sergio took care of the decorations, filling the house with balloons and colorful streamers. Sewell helped make the invitations, drawing each one by hand. The day of the party arrived on a sunny Saturday in September. The house was full of children, laughter, and mess. Julia was there, along with other schoolmates. Mrs. Irene helped in the kitchen, serving snacks and juice. Joe Miller, who had never entered the main house as a guest, was uncomfortable at first, but soon relaxed as he watched Leah run from one side to the other, radiant. When it was time for happy birthday, everyone gathered around the table. The cake was simple, chocolate with colorful candles. Leah blew hard, closing her eyes and making a wish. Everyone applauded, sang, celebrated. Helen looked at the scene, and for the first time in years, she felt something that wasn't guilt, wasn't fear, wasn't shame. It was joy, pure, simple, true. After the guests left, and the house returned to silence, Leah climbed onto Helen's lap, something she rarely did, and said, "Thank you, Mum. It was the best party in the world." Helen hugged her daughter tightly, feeling her heart overflow. "You're welcome, my child. There will be many more, I promise." That night, after Leah fell asleep, Helen went out to the porch. The sky was starry, and the cold night air carried the smell of wet earth. Sergio joined her, and the two stood there side by side, looking at the horizon. "Do you think we made it?" Helen asked. Sergio thought, "I think we are making it. And that's a lot." Helen agreed. She thought about everything that had happened, everything that had changed. She thought about Clarice, the sister she had lost, and felt a pain that would never completely disappear. But she also felt gratitude, because Clarice had left Sewell, and Sewell had saved Leah, and Leah had saved all of them. The next day, Helen did something she had never done. She went to the town cemetery, found Clarice's grave, and stood there, looking at the simple headstone. There were no flowers, no decorations, just the name and the dates. Helen knelt, wiped the dust with her hand, and said, "I'm sorry, Clarice, for not coming after you, for not supporting you, for letting fear speak louder. But I will take care of your daughter. I promise. I will give her what you couldn't. And I will teach my daughter to be strong like you were." She stayed there for a while in silence, just feeling the cold wind and the weight of unspoken words. When she stood up, she felt lighter. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It wasn't total redemption. But it was a step. And sometimes, that's all one can give. The months continued to pass, and life in St. James followed its rhythm. Leah grew, learned, developed. Sewell, too. The two cousins were inseparable, united by a story that no one else could undo. Helen and Sergio kept trying, making mistakes, getting things right, but always together, and St. Clair Farm, which for so long had been a place of shadows, began to resemble a home. One spring afternoon, as Leah and Sewell played in the garden, Helen watched them from the window. She saw the two, laughing, running, free. And she understood, finally, what truly mattered. It wasn't the surname, it wasn't the reputation, it wasn't the opinion of others. It was that moment, that joy, that life. And as the sun set over the hills of St. James, painting the sky orange and pink. The story of two girls who met in the dark and saved each other continued to be written, not with words but with gestures, with hugs, with presence, with love, because in the end that's what remains. Not the mistakes, not the fears, not the appearances, but love. The love that heals, that transforms, that liberates, and that no one can take away. 5 years had passed since Leah's first birthday party. St. James remained the same small town, with its cobblestone streets, its main square, and its secrets that were now told with fewer whispers and more naturally. But for the Anderson family, everything had changed. Not abruptly, not with dramatic twists, but with the silent constancy of those who choose every day to be different from yesterday. Leah was 12 years old now. She was in the 7th grade, had a loyal group of friends, and participated in the church choir. Her skin still required care, but she had learned to deal with it without shame, without hiding. She used sunscreen, avoided strong sun during peak hours, and when someone asked about the spots, she explained naturally, "It's a skin condition, nothing much." And it really wasn't. But what impressed most about Leah wasn't her appearance, it was her personality. She had become a strong, empathetic girl, with an incredible ability to sense when someone was suffering. At school, she was known for welcoming newcomers, for sitting next to those who were alone, for defending those who were the target of jokes. Teachers said she had a huge heart. Helen, when she heard this, felt a mixture of pride and regret. Pride for what her daughter had become, regret for almost having destroyed it. Sol, for her part, was 17 years old. She had finished high school with excellent grades and earned a scholarship to study social work at a university in Boston. She still lived with Mrs. Irene, who was now older and more fragile, but continued to be the solid foundation Sol needed. The street girl who once had nothing now had everything that mattered: education, family, purpose. Sol visited the farm frequently. Even with the busy routine of studies and work, she always found time to see Leah. The two talked for hours about everything and nothing, about Leah's dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about Sol's plans to work with vulnerable children, about life, about the future. They were more than cousins, they were soul sisters. Helen had changed in ways she herself never imagined possible. She remained elegant, but now with an elegance that came from within, not from expensive clothes or jewelry. She had become a kind of local activist, working with child protective services, giving talks on the dangers of prejudice and emotional neglect, and helping other families facing similar difficulties. She used her own story as an example, unafraid of being judged, unashamed to admit her mistakes. In one of these talks, held at Leah's school, Helen spoke to an audience of parents and teachers. "I hid my daughter for years because I was afraid of what you would think. Afraid that she wouldn't be perfect enough. Afraid that I wouldn't be perfect enough. And in that process, I almost destroyed her. I almost destroyed myself. I learned, in the worst possible way, that perfection doesn't exist, and that trying to achieve it only distances us from what truly matters: love, acceptance, humanity." The audience listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with thoughtful expressions. When she finished, there was applause. It wasn't applause of celebration, but of recognition, of respect. Leah, who was sitting in the front row, looked at her mother with a pride that warmed her chest. Sol beside her squeezed her hand. "Your mum is amazing." Leah smiled. "She is." Sergio had also changed. He had retired from business, handing over management to trusted partners, and now dedicated most of his time to his family. He took Leah fishing in the river, taught Sol to drive, helped Mrs. Irene with repairs around the house. He had discovered, perhaps too late but still in time, the joy of being present, of being a father, of being an uncle, of being human. One Saturday afternoon, while fishing in the river that cut through the farm, Leah asked, "Dad, do you regret anything?" Sergio looked at his daughter, surprised by the question. He thought for a moment, then replied, "I regret not having been brave sooner, for letting fear paralyze me, but I don't regret being here now." "With you?" Leah smiled. "Me neither." Meanwhile, in town, a project was taking shape. Helen, with the support of Sergio and some local institutions, was building a support center for vulnerable children. A place where they could receive medical care, psychological support, education, and most importantly, shelter. The idea had come up in a conversation with Sol, who had said, "Imagine how many children are going through what I went through, or what Leah went through. We could do something." And they did. The center was built on land donated by the town hall, with funds from donations and part of the Anderson family's fortune. Helen made sure it was a beautiful, welcoming, light-filled place. She didn't want it to seem institutional, cold. She wanted the children to feel at home. She wanted them to feel seen. The inauguration was scheduled for a November morning. The entire town was invited. There were banners, balloons, music, but the most important moment was when Helen went up to the small stage set up in front of the building and said, "This center is named after Clarice Meadows, my sister, a woman who faced the world alone, who was courageous when I was cowardly, and who left a legacy of love in the form of an incredible daughter." Helen looked at Sewell, who was in the audience, and continued, "Clarice is no longer here, but her story has not died. It lives in every child we will welcome here. It lives in every family we will help. It lives in every second of love we will offer. This place is for her, and for all the Clarices, Leahs, and souls of the world." There was applause, much applause. Then, one by one, people went up to the stage to share their stories. Beatrice spoke about how the center had saved her and Laura. An 18-year-old young man, who had been welcomed at 10, spoke about how he had graduated from high school and received a scholarship for college. A mother spoke about how she had received psychological support and had managed to escape an abusive situation. These were stories of pain, but also of overcoming, of new beginnings, of hope. When the celebration ended and people began to leave, Helen asked to stay a little longer. She sat on a bench in the courtyard, looking at the building that bore her sister's name, and felt a deep peace. Sergio sat beside her. "Tired?" Helen smiled. "No, I'm just appreciating." Sergio looked around. "We did something good, didn't we?" Helen agreed. "We did." Leah and Raphael joined them, followed by Sol. The five stood there in silence, just existing together. After a while, Helen said, "I want you to know one thing. When I'm gone, and it will be soon, I don't want sadness. I want you to remember this moment, this peace, this love, because that's what matters. That's what remains." Leah protested. "Mom, don't talk like that." Helen touched her daughter's face. "My child, life is like this. We are born, we live, and we leave. But what we leave behind, that remains. And I will leave you, this family, this love, this legacy. And that is more than I deserved." Sewell held Helen's hand. "You deserve everything, everything good." Helen smiled. "I have everything good. Have you?" That night they all returned to the farm. They had dinner together, laughed together, shared memories. Joe Miller, who was now retired but still lived in a house at the back of the property, joined them. He told old stories, made everyone laugh, and when the night advanced, he said goodbye with a hug to each one. Helen went up to her room, tired but happy. Sergio helped her lie down, covered her carefully, and lay beside her. They held hands, looking at the ceiling, and Helen said, "Thank you for everything, for staying, for trying, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it." Sergio squeezed her hand. "I thank you for giving me a second chance, for building all this with me." They slept like that, holding hands, and when the sun rose the next day, Helen woke weaker, but still lucid. She asked to see Leah and Sewell. The two came, sat on the edge of the bed, and Helen looked at them with a love so great it almost hurt. "You are my greatest pride, my greatest achievement. Take care of each other, always." Leah and Sewell promised, tears streaming down their faces. Helen closed her eyes, took a deep breath and whispered, "Clarice, I tried, I hope you are proud." And then, surrounded by the family she had built, by the daughter she had learned to love, by the niece who had saved everything, Helen Anderson passed away. Not with fear, not with regret, but with peace. The funeral was simple as she had requested. Many people attended, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine respect. They spoke about Helen's transformation, about the good she had done, about the legacy she left. And when they lowered the coffin next to Clarice's grave, Leah felt that finally the two sisters were together again. The following months were difficult. Helen's absence was felt in every corner of the farm, in every center meeting, in every moment. But life continued, as it always does. Sergio, despite the pain, remained strong, taking care of the farm, supporting the girls. Leah and Raphael continued with the clinic, expanding, helping. Saul continued traveling, multiplying the center's model, honoring her aunt's memory. And on a spring afternoon, a year after Helen's passing, the family gathered at the cemetery. They brought flowers, cleaned Helen's and Clarice's graves, and stood there in silence, just remembering. Then Leah said, "I think she would be happy to see how far we've come." Saul agreed. "Definitely." Sergio, his voice choked, said, "She is happy. Wherever she is happy." They returned to the farm, where Raphael had prepared lunch. They ate together, talked, laughed, and they realized that despite the pain, despite the absence, they still had each other. They still had love. They still had purpose. And as the sun set over St. James, painting the sky orange and pink, the story of the Anderson family continued. Not with Helen, physically present, but with her spirit in every action, in every choice, in every gesture of love. Because legacies don't die. Legacies live on, in the people we touch, in the lives we change, in the love we leave behind. And this, the legacy of Helen, of Clarice, of Saul, of Leah, of everyone who was part of this journey, was a legacy of transformation, of forgiveness, of new beginnings, of hope. And this legacy, that indeed, was eternal. 10 years had passed since the inauguration of the Clarice Meadows Center. St. James had grown a little, gained some new streets, a larger supermarket, but it remained that town where everyone knew each other and stories intertwined like threads of an old tapestry. The center had become a regional reference, welcoming children not only from St. James, but from neighboring towns, and the Anderson family story was now told not as a scandal, but as an example of transformation. Sue was 27 years old. She had become a respected professional, with specializations in child protection and community development. She managed the Clarice Meadows Center with the same passion as on the first day, but now with the experience of someone who had seen hundreds of stories, each unique, each important. She lived in a small apartment downtown, but spent most of her time at the farm or the center. Mrs. Irene had passed away 3 years ago, peacefully in her sleep, after a long and well-lived life. Saul had cried for weeks, but she knew that the woman who raised her had left the world in peace, knowing that the girl she had taken in had become someone incredible. Leah was 22 and in her final year of veterinary school. She was a beautiful young woman with an easy smile and a gentle gaze who carried the marks on her skin not as scars, but as part of who she was. She had dated a few times, nothing serious, and said she was more interested in finishing college and opening her veterinary clinic on the farm than in thinking about marriage. Helen joked that she was just like her father, too focused on work, but deep down she admired her daughter's independence. Helen was 65. Her hair, once always pulled back in a perfect bun, was now grey and loose, falling over her shoulders. She wore less makeup, more comfortable clothes, and had a lighter way of moving through the world. She continued to volunteer at the center, but had slowed her pace, respecting the limits of a body that was beginning to complain. Sergio, at 68, had developed some health problems, nothing serious but requiring care. He had controlled diabetes and mild arthritis, but remained active, managing the farm with the help of Joe Miller, who, despite his age, insisted on not fully retiring. It was on an April morning, with autumn painting the trees in golden hues, that something unexpected happened. Saul was in the center's office, reviewing reports when the secretary knocked on the door. "There's a woman here who wants to speak with you, says it's urgent." Saul frowned. She had no scheduled meetings. "Send her in." The woman who entered was young, perhaps 25, thin, with deep dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands. She carried a battered backpack and had the look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Sul stood up, indicated a chair. "Sit, please. Would you like some water?" The woman nodded, drank the entire glass at once, and then said in a hoarse voice, "My name is Beatrice, and I need help, not for me, for my daughter." Sul picked up a pen, ready to take notes. "Go ahead." Beatrice took a deep breath. "My daughter is 4 years old. Her father, he's not a good person. We lived in Boston, but I had to run. He always found me. I moved cities 3 times. I came here because I heard about this center that you help children. I have no money, nowhere to stay, but I need my daughter to be safe." Sul listened to everything, taking notes, but mostly observing. She saw the desperation in Beatrice's eyes, the exhaustion, the fear. She knew that look. She had seen it in many women who had passed through the center. "Where is your daughter now?" Beatrice hesitated. "She's outside, afraid to come in. She's afraid of strangers." Sul stood up. "Can I meet her?" They went out together. In the hallway, leaning against the wall, was a small girl with dark hair and huge eyes, hugging a faded teddy bear. When she saw Sul, she cowered even more. Sul knelt down, getting to her level, and smiled. "Hi. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. Beatrice approached. "Her name is Laura. She's scared." Sul continued, smiling. "It's okay, Laura. I used to get scared too when I met new people, but this is a safe place. Want to see?" Laura looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Then slowly she gave her hand to Sul. The 3 entered the center, and Sul showed them the rooms, the toys, the other children playing. Laura began to relax, let go of Sul's hand, and went to a box of building blocks. Beatrice watched, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." Sul touched her shoulder. "We're going to help. Come, let's talk about the next steps." In the following hours, Sul activated the support network. She secured a temporary spot in a safe shelter for Beatrice and Laura, contacted partner lawyers to handle the legal matters, and scheduled psychological counseling for both. Beatrice cried with relief. "I don't know how to thank you." Sul shook her head. "No need to thank me. You just need to take care of yourself and your daughter, and let us help." When Beatrice and Laura left, accompanied by a social worker, Sul stood at the office window looking out at the street. She thought about how many Beatrices there were out there, how many Lauras, how many stories of fear, flight, survival. And she felt, as she always did in these moments, a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness for the suffering, determination to keep fighting. That night, Sul went to dinner at the farm, as she did at least twice a week. Helen had prepared chicken with okra, rice, and cornmeal porridge, real New England comfort food. Leah was there too, enjoying the weekend to rest from her studies. Sergio presided over the table, serving wine for the women and juice for himself because of his diabetes. During dinner, Sul told them about Beatrice and Laura. Helen listened in silence, with that expression Sul knew well, a mixture of compassion and pain. When Sul finished, Helen said, "That woman had courage. Running away isn't easy. Starting over is even harder." Sul agreed. "That's why we need to be here. So when they have the courage, they have somewhere to go." Leah, who had been quiet, asked, "And the girl? How was she?" Sul thought. "Scared, but also strong. You can see she learned to protect herself." Leah sighed. "Children shouldn't have to learn that." Sul looked at her cousin. "They shouldn't, but they do. And when they learn, we have to teach them again. Teach them that not everyone hurts, that they can trust, that they can be children." Sergio, who rarely spoke about heavy topics, said, "You two do important work, more important than anything I've done in my entire life." Sul and Leah looked at him surprised. Sergio continued, "I spent my life building businesses, accumulating money, thinking that was success. But you two, you build lives, that's success." Helen reached out, touched Sergio's hand. "You built too. Maybe it took time, but you built." Sergio smiled a little awkwardly. "I tried, I still try." Helen squeezed his hand. "And that's what matters." After dinner, Leah and Sewell went for a walk around the farm. The night was clear, with a full moon illuminating the coffee plantations. They walked in silence for a while, just appreciating the peace. Then Leah said, "Have you ever thought about having children?" Sewell laughed. "Sometimes. But I think I already have so many children to take care of that I don't know if I'd have time for more. And you?" Leah shrugged. "I think about it, but I also don't know if it's for me. I like my freedom. I like being able to focus on work, on animals." Sewell looked at her cousin. "We don't have to follow the script everyone expects, do we? Get married, have kids, a house with a white fence." Leah laughed. "Definitely not. We've already proven that." They stopped near the old barn, where everything had begun. It was renovated now, transformed into a proper storage space, but it still carried the memory. Leah looked at the building. "Do you remember the first time you saw me here?" Sewell smiled. "I do. You were so small, so quiet." Leah turned to her cousin. "You saved me, you know that, right?" Sewell shook her head. "We saved each other. I was as lost as you, just in a different way." Leah thought. "Maybe we met because we needed to." Sewell agreed. "Maybe. Or maybe we just got lucky." Leah smiled. "Either way, the important thing is that it happened." And it really was. Because in the end, it didn't matter if it was destiny, luck, or just a series of choices that led two girls to cross paths on a rainy night, in a forgotten barn. What mattered was what they did with that encounter, how they transformed pain into healing, loneliness into companionship, fear into courage. The months passed. Laura and Beatrice stabilized. They found a small apartment. Beatrice got a permanent job and Laura started attending school. The protective order was granted, and the father, who had tried to locate them, gave up after being legally notified. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a safe, new beginning. One Saturday afternoon, Beatrice brought Laura to the farm as Leah had promised. The girl met the animals, played with the dogs, and fell in love with a striped kitten that had just been born. Leah let her choose a name. Laura thought and said, "Hope." Leah smiled. "Perfect." While Laura played with the kitten in the garden, Beatrice talked with Helen on the porch. She spoke about the life she had left behind, about the fear, about the courage she had needed to gather. Helen listened, and when Beatrice finished, she said, "You did the right thing, and everything will be okay." "It won't be easy, but it will be okay." Beatrice wiped her tears. "How do you know?" Helen looked at Leah, who was kneeling beside Laura, laughing. "Because I've been on the other side, on the side of those who make mistakes, and I learned that you can always start over. Always." When Beatrice and Laura left, taking the kitten in a box, Helen stayed on the porch watching the car drive down the road. Sewell, who had just arrived, sat beside her. "Another story with a happy ending," Helen smiled. "Hopefully." Sewell looked at her aunt. "You changed a lot of people, you know." Helen shook her head. "It wasn't me, it was life. It was pain. It was the need to fix what I broke." Sewell touched her hand. Whatever it was, it made a difference. That night, the family gathered for dinner. Leah had brought a cake she had made, a little crooked but tasty. Sergio joked that she was better with animals than with baking, and everyone laughed. Joe Miller, who now dined with the family whenever invited, told old stories about the farm, about when Leah was little, and he saw her hidden, wishing he could do more. Helen listened to the stories, and for the first time she felt no shame, no paralyzing guilt. She felt only gratitude. Gratitude for Joe Miller having cared when she didn't. Gratitude for Sewell having appeared. Gratitude for having had the chance to change. She raised her glass of wine and said, "A toast to family. Not the one that's born ready, but the one we build." Everyone raised their glasses. To family. And as they toasted, as they laughed, as they existed together in that simple but profound moment, the story continued to be written. Not with definitive endings, not with ready answers, but with the certainty that no matter what came, they would be together. And that, in the end, was everything. 5 years had passed since Laura and Beatrice had arrived at the Clarice Meadows Centre. The girl was now 9 years old, doing well in school, participating in the school choir, and the kitten Hope had grown into a lazy, affectionate adult cat who slept in Laura's bed every night. Beatrice had become the bakery manager, had made friends in town, and for the first time in a long time, felt safe. It was stories like these that kept Saul awake late, working, planning, dreaming of ways to help more people. Saul was 32 years old. She had recently received an unexpected proposal. A national child protection organization wanted to use the Clarice Meadows Centre model as a reference to implement similar projects in other cities. They wanted Saul to coordinate the expansion, travel, train teams, and share her experience. It was a huge opportunity, but also daunting. It meant leaving St. James, at least partially. It meant stepping away from her routine, her family, everything she knew. Leah was 27 and had finally inaugurated her veterinary clinic on the farm. It was a beautiful, modern space with state-of-the-art equipment that Sergio had insisted on financing. She treated large and small animals and already had a loyal clientele that came from several towns in the region. Leah worked long hours, but loved every minute. She said there was nothing better than seeing a sick animal recover, than returning a healthy pet to its owner, than making a difference even if it was one life at a time. It was during an emergency call on a rainy June night that Leah met Raphael. He had arrived at the clinic with a horse that had been seriously injured, coming from Boston because he had heard about the competence of the St. James veterinarian. Leah treated the animal, performed the necessary surgery, and saved the horse's life. Raphael, impressed, asked where she had studied, how much experience she had, and when Leah answered, he smiled. "You're incredible." Leah, embarrassed, thanked him. In the following days, Raphael returned to monitor the horse's recovery. Always polite, always interested, always asking intelligent questions, Leah discovered that he was also a veterinarian, that he worked at a large clinic in Boston, but that he was tired of the city, thinking of moving to the countryside. They talked about veterinary medicine, about difficult cases, about the passion they shared for animals, and gradually their conversations extended beyond the professional and into the personal. When the horse was discharged, Raphael invited Leah to dinner. She hesitated, not used to this kind of attention, but something about him made her comfortable. She accepted. They dined at a simple restaurant in downtown St. James, talked for hours, and when the night ended, Leah realized she had enjoyed it. A lot. Saul, who heard everything with a mischievous smile, teased her cousin. "Finally. I thought you were going to marry the animals." Leah threw a pillow at her. "Shut up, it was just dinner." Saul laughed. "Sure, just dinner. That's why you've been smiling like a fool for 3 days." While Leah explored this new possibility, Saul struggled with the decision about the job offer. She talked with Helen, who said, "You need to do what's best for you, not for me, not for the center. For you." Saul sighed. "But what if I leave and everything falls apart?" Helen shook her head. "It won't. You've built a strong team. And besides, it's not like you're going to disappear. You'll continue to coordinate, just in a different way." Saul talked with Sergio, who was more direct. "Opportunities like this don't come twice. If you don't accept, you'll regret it." Saul knew he was right, but still, the fear persisted. She talked with Leah, who said, "I'll miss you, but I'll also be proud. You deserve this. You deserve to grow, to expand, to show the world what we do here." After weeks of thinking, Saul accepted the proposal. She would start slowly, traveling 1 week a month, coordinating the center remotely and training a substitute to take over local management. It was frightening, but also exciting. And for the first time, Saul allowed herself to dream big, not just of one center, but of a network, of dozens of centers, of thousands of children being helped. Meanwhile, at the farm, Helen began to feel the effects of age more intensely. She had developed heart problems, nothing immediate but requiring care. Doctors recommended less stress, more rest, controlled medication. Sergio, despite his own health issues, became even more attentive, caring for his wife with a dedication that was moving. One afternoon when Helen was resting on the porch, Leah sat beside her. "Mom, are you okay?" Helen smiled. "I'm tired, my child, but I'm fine." Leah held her hand. "Do you need anything?" Helen looked at her daughter, at the face that had become so beautiful, so strong, and said, "I already have everything. I have you. I have Saul. I have your father. I have peace. I don't need anything else." Leah felt her eyes sting. "You know I love you, right?" Helen squeezed her daughter's hand. "I know. And you know I love you too. I always did. I just didn't know how to show it." Leah rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "You learned. And that's what matters." They stayed there in silence, just appreciating each other's company. Sergio, who watched from the window, felt his chest tighten. He knew that time was passing, that Helen's health was fragile, that the years were taking their toll, but he also knew that they had made good use of the time they had, that they had fixed what was broken, that they had loved, finally, in the right way. Raphael continued to appear in Leah's life. Dinners became frequent, then turned into outings, then into weekends together. He met the family, dined at the farm, talked with Sergio about business and with Helen about the center. Saul approved of him immediately, saying that anyone who made Leah smile like that deserved a chance. And Leah, for the first time, allowed herself to think about the future, about partnership, about love. On a starry night, after dinner at the farm, Raphael officially asked Leah to be his girlfriend. It wasn't elaborate, just the two of them sitting in the garden with the sound of crickets in the background and him saying, "I want to be with you, truly, if you want to, too." Leah smiled, her eyes shining. "I do." When she told the family, Helen cried with joy. Sergio hugged Raphael and said, "Take good care of my daughter." Raphael promised, "I will." Saul hugged Leah and whispered, "You deserve to be happy." Leah returned the hug. "You too. When are you going to find someone?" Saul laughed. "When someone comes along who makes me smile like Raphael makes you smile." The months passed. Saul began to travel, visiting cities, getting to know different realities, training teams. It was tiring but rewarding. She received messages from Leah almost every day, talking about the clinic, about Raphael, about the family. And even far away she felt connected. Raphael, who had fallen in love not only with Leah but with St. James, decided to move permanently. He sold his share in the Boston clinic and became Leah's partner. Together they expanded the clinic, hired another veterinarian and began offering free services to low-income families. It was a way of giving back, of making a difference, of continuing the legacy of care that the Anderson family had built. One October afternoon, the Clarice Meadows Center celebrated its 15th anniversary. A celebration was organized, with the presence of authorities, partners, and especially children and families who had been helped over the years. The courtyard was decorated with balloons, banners, and tables full of food. There was music, laughter, and an energy of gratitude that filled the air. Sol, who had returned specially for the celebration, went up to the stage to speak. She looked at the crowd, saw familiar faces, stories she had followed, lives that had been transformed, and felt her chest overflow. 15 years ago, this center was born out of pain, from the pain of a family that made mistakes, that got lost, but that had the courage to start over. My Aunt Helen, who is here today, transformed her story into purpose, and that purpose saved hundreds of lives. Helen, sitting in the front row beside Sergio, wiped away tears. Saul continued, "But this center isn't just about the past. It's about the future, about every child who will pass through here and will find shelter, care, love, about every family that will have a second chance, about every story that will have a different ending. And that is the legacy we want to leave." And there was applause, much applause. Then, one by one, people went up to the stage to share their stories. Beatrice spoke about how the center had saved her and Laura. An 18-year-old young man, who had been welcomed at 10, spoke about how he had graduated from high school and gotten a scholarship for college. A mother spoke about how she had received psychological support and had managed to escape an abusive situation. These were stories of pain, but also of overcoming, of new beginnings, of hope. When the celebration ended and people began to leave, Helen asked to stay a little longer. She sat on a bench in the courtyard, looking at the building that bore her sister's name, and felt a profound peace. Sergio sat beside her. "Tired?" Helen smiled. "No, I'm just appreciating." Sergio looked around. "We did something good, didn't we?" Helen agreed. "We did." Leah and Raphael joined them, followed by Saul. The five stood there in silence, just existing together. After a while, Helen said, "I want you to know one thing. When I'm gone, and it will be soon, I don't want sadness. I want you to remember this. This moment, this peace, this love. Because that's what matters. That's what remains." Leah protested. "Mom, don't talk like that." Helen touched her daughter's face. "My child, life is like this. We are born, we live, and we leave. But what we leave, that remains. And I will leave you, this family, this love, this legacy, and that is more than I deserved." Saul held Helen's hand. "You deserve everything, everything good." Helen smiled. "I have everything good. I have you." That night they all returned to the farm. They had dinner together, laughed together, shared memories. Joe Miller, who was now retired but continued living in a house at the back of the property, joined them. He told old stories, made everyone laugh, and when the night advanced, he said goodbye with a hug to each one. Helen went up to her room, tired but happy. Sergio helped her lie down, covered her carefully, and lay beside her. They held hands, looking at the ceiling, and Helen said, "Thank you for everything, for staying, for trying, for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it." Sergio squeezed her hand. "I thank you for giving me a second chance, for building all this with me." They slept like that, holding hands, and when the sun rose the next day, Helen woke weaker but still lucid. She asked to see Leah and Saul. The two came, sat on the edge of the bed, and Helen looked at them with a love so great that it almost hurt. "You are my greatest pride, my greatest achievement. Take care of each other, always." Leah and Saul promised, tears streaming down their faces. Helen closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Clarice, I tried. I hope you are proud." And then, surrounded by the family she had built, by the daughter she had learned to love, by the niece who had saved everything, Helen Anderson passed away. Not with fear, not with regret, but with peace. The funeral was simple, as she had requested. Many people attended, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine respect. They spoke about Helen's transformation, about the good she had done, about the legacy she left. And when they lowered the coffin, next to Clarice's grave, Leah felt that finally the two sisters were together again. The following months were difficult. Helen's absence was felt in every corner of the farm, in every center meeting, in every moment. But life continued as it always does. Sergio, despite the pain, remained strong, taking care of the farm, supporting the girls. Leah and Raphael continued with the clinic, expanding, helping. Saul continued traveling, multiplying the center's model, honoring her aunt's memory. And on a spring afternoon, a year after Helen's passing, the family gathered at the cemetery. They brought flowers, cleaned Helen's and Clarice's graves, and stood there in silence, just remembering. Then Leah said, "I think she would be happy to see where we've come." Saul agreed. "Definitely." Sergio, his voice choked, said, "She is happy. Wherever she is happy." They returned to the farm where Raphael had prepared lunch. They ate together, talked, laughed, and they realized that, despite the pain, despite the absence, they still had each other. They still had love. They still had purpose. And as the sun set over St. James, painting the sky orange and pink, the story of the Anderson family continued. Not with Helen physically present, but with her spirit in every action, in every choice, in every gesture of love. Because legacies don't die, legacies live. In the people we touch, in the lives we change, in the love we leave behind. And this, the legacy of Helen, of Clarice, of Saul, of Leah, of all who were part of this journey, was a legacy of transformation, of forgiveness, of new beginnings, of hope. And this legacy, that indeed, was eternal.